By the latter half of the 1980s, Nintendo had grown astronomically large in the video game market, considering how popular Atari was back in the 1970s. This simultaneously reconstructed what was thought to be a dead market a decade prior. But by the time that the mid to late 1980s rolled around and technological advancements became a lot more prominent in Japanese technology companies, let's just say that they did have competitors, but they weren't expecting for Nintendo to respond back with its own weapon.
The late 1980s, Nintendo had officially become a household name in American homes. More and more video games were crafted for the NES, and video games were becoming a part of the same podium as music and films were established as dominating pieces of culture. Nintendo's partnerships with other video game manufacturers were starting to underscore the fact that Nintendo was definitely not playing around at this point. As Nintendo started to introduce new games, third-party support, new methods of playing with power such as introducing merchandise, an American hotline, and a magazine series, competition started to learn from the sidelines and see exactly what this new Nintendo name was all about. Sega Enterprises, originally a division of Gulf and Western, was one of the larger arcade cabinet manufacturers actively working in the United States back then. Competitive work alongside other manufacturers like Konami, Atari, and Midway made Sega one of the driven companies to try and get at what most manufacturers yearned for with the popularity that Nintendo had achieved. Nintendo had worked with their ex-competitors after the release of the NES, turning their competitors' respective games into their own accurate ports for the NES, ultimately winning them over to negotiate a deal together. Although it took a lot of time for companies to trust Nintendo with their intellectual properties, Nintendo can at least say that they were undefeated the more the company started to grow from an obscure Japanese toy company to being comparable to major corporations that took longer to reach that podium, almost to the height of companies like Sony or Toshiba. Sega was not going to fall into Nintendo's trap. They wanted to compete and they had a goal to win.
Make no mistake, these motherfuckers were gonna stick it up to the big boy, and they were gonna try as hard as they could to come out to the top.
Sega wasn't necessarily new to competition with Nintendo, but they were sure as hell pissed that they were failing hard after the release of the Sega Master System. Sure, they were large successes in other regions like Europe and Brazil, but Nintendo had their grip on the industry when it came to third parties in other regions like in Japan and in North America, thus causing third-party manufacturers and developers to obligate themselves to create video games for, and sometimes only for, Nintendo. This definitely made Sega very determined to not be undermined by Nintendo's success, and Sega got to work on developing a new system that can beat out the NES in spectacular 16-bit fashion. Marketing was the name of the game here, and this is what would eventually become one of the most infamous console wars in the history of video games. The concept for a Sega home console came into fruition after a painful downturn in the arcade business of Sega, even before the Famicom released in Japan. The company's state was falling into a spiral of problems as people started to stray away from video games as the main hotspot for kids and teenagers to hang out in. Most of the audience in video arcades were kids or teenagers that had responsibilities like school, clubs, or sports. So during a school year where kids had to focus on their academics or sports, it became pretty obvious that less kids had enough time to go to an arcade. Coupled up with the fact that video arcades were being seen as a fad that would die out by the end of the decade. The Sega SG-1000 was Sega's first attempt at making a home console for kids and teens to play video games at home, releasing on the exact day the Famicom released on July 15th. Contrary to popular belief, the Sega SG-1000 was not the console blatantly competing toe-to-toe with the Famicom, despite the systems both being born on the same day. Sega was still starting out and didn't know exactly what they were competing with until officially studying Nintendo's practices in the video game market. It's like assuming that two babies who would end up becoming rival boxers have been fighting the moment that they were out of the womb. That's not how it works. Eventually, the Sega Genesis was officially starting to get into development somewhere during the NES's lifespan to further grab the concept of understanding what was needed to reel in new fans and consumers of this new Sega console. Motivated by learning from the sidelines of what Nintendo could do, Sega took notes from what came of the SG-1000. The Sega SG-1000 sold enough units to further exceed the company's expectations of the outcome of the console, while simultaneously understanding that the Nintendo Famicom outsold sales of the SG-1000 by a 10-to-1 ratio. While the console that would be the Genesis was being developed, Sega made another console in the meantime to test out the waters of the home console market by releasing the Sega Master System, a console that was blatantly made to compete with Nintendo's Famicom. It's safe to say that Sega failed to challenge Nintendo as it was achieving massive successes internationally that Sega wasn't familiar with.
So it wasn't necessarily a you snooze you lose situation, more so Nintendo just had an advantage that almost seemed unfair. What did I just say a few minutes ago?
Sega wasn't necessarily new to competition with Nintendo, but they were sure as hell pissed that they were failing hard after the release of the Sega Master System. But Nintendo had their grip on the industry when it came to third parties in other regions like in Japan and in North America, thus causing third-party manufacturers and developers to obligate themselves to create video games for and sometimes only for Nintendo. Things all changed once the Sega Genesis released to the public in 1988, right before the end of the third generation of consoles. And Sega had an ace up their sleeve because once the Genesis released, everyone who had ever already had an idea of what a video game looked like were going to absolutely have their minds blown. The Nintendo Entertainment System was the pinnacle of pristine arcade game graphics. This console had so many recognizable games, was the console that had some of the most accurate looking graphics in comparison to arcades, but then the 16-bit era hit the shelves. This was no longer Nintendo's throne. The biggest company in the American home entertainment market was finally starting to lose its grip once this sick son of a bitch came out with these big ass boxes that looked ahead of their time. This was the Sega Genesis.
Holy shit, the future is here, partner, and it's called 16-bit technology.
It was looking like a pretty bad threat on Nintendo's side, and things were starting to tense up once they found out that there was a console with a major technological advancement that no other home console could match. Or it seemed. Technically speaking, there were consoles that had 16-bit processors like the TurboGrafx 16 and... God, the Intellivision?
You ever wonder why nobody remembers these guys?
Anyway, I slipped the damn dramatic effect out of my hands. The Sega Genesis came out in October 1988 in Japan and August 1989 in North America.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do?
Nintendo officially had a threat, shots were fired, and Sega was taking all responsibility to wave the flag of war in their faces.
Don't have blast processing?
The campaign started. Genesis does what Nintendo don't.
Genesis does.
16-bit arcade graphics.
We can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does.
The Sega Genesis was a console that had all of the bragging rights when the console first hit the scene in the US, officially being an advanced video game system with the latest and greatest 16-bit processor. 2 advanced sounding audio chips that was leagues better than the NES audio processor. Hell, the Genesis audio chips were co-created by Yamaha and Texas Instruments.
Guys, my life is like a Genesis song. Your lives are like some bullshit. Super Nintendo.
This console was making the most accurate depictions of arcade titles, as if the Nintendo Entertainment System wasn't already accurate enough with its graphics. The new kid on the block was getting its fame. But now, the king returned. September 9th, 1987 rolls around and Hiroshi Yamauchi reveals the new development of a successor to the Nintendo Entertainment System, projecting for the console to be a leap of an advancement from the predecessor, claiming that it would boast a much advanced picture processing unit that would simulate 3-dimensional effects and environments, a much larger color palette, the new development of a 4th installment of the Super Mario Bros. Series, and Dragon Quest V, and finally, a controller that made sense. A prototype was shown off to the Japanese press in 1988. Later, a delay was made as the result of issues regarding third-party software technology and a global chip shortage. The development of Super Mario World finally started and was taking its needed time to become a launch title for the Super Famicom, which, by the way, was officially starting to become the name for the new Nintendo system. Japanese name only, of course.
Whatever will the American version be called?
Can't say I was surprised. I absolutely love the design of the Japanese Super Famicom over the American Super Nintendo. I don't know, maybe something about the design reminded me a lot of the land speeders from Star Wars. Unfortunately, the Super Nintendo looked nothing like the Super Famicom. The SNES looked like a very blocky kid's toy with purple fidget switches. I never really liked this design. I know I said that the Super Nintendo looked like a kid's toy, but the Super Nintendo has a nice look for it having a multicolored design. Apparently, Nintendo thought keeping the multicolored design would make the SNES look like a kid's toy. Says the company who's replacing the switches to look like this. Really? Anyway, taking a look at the American advertisements for the Super Nintendo. Oh my god! It's magnificent! It's glorious! It's my 2 favorite colors in one advertising campaign! The US Super Nintendo advertising was absolutely amazing. There were many geometric shapes and colors placed that I don't know the meaning of, but what I am sure as hell certain of is that this was meant to have that cool teenager to young adult factor in the console. The Nintendo Play It Loud advertising campaign was made to give Nintendo a badass look for the 90s, absolutely going for a head-to-head competition with Sega. While it was mainly focused for the Game Boy campaign, it also supported the Super Nintendo once the console hit the scene, which I think suited the SNES a lot better than the Game Boy's design. The red and black color scheme, the 16 dots on the side of the box to represent 16-bit technology, and the subtle addition of the Super Famicom logo. Nice! Nintendo released Super Mario World as a launch title right when the Super Nintendo came out, and might quite possibly be the best installment of the Super Mario Bros. Series to date. This game still has one of the most immersive, consistent, and jaw-dropping gameplay that I have ever seen. I originally played it on my older sister's Game Boy Advance and had finally gotten an SNES Classic Edition to play the original game in full quality with the original controllers. 9 whole worlds on one gigantic interactive map instead of the separate world maps from Super Mario Bros. 3, a cool new way to navigate levels, and the new concept of secret levels with the Cape Feather power-up, 96 whole levels across the entire game, the ability to save your game, and finally, the introduction of a new character named Yoshi, a big green dinosaur that helps you navigate levels with a trusty steed. Or dinosaur in this case. Outside of this amazing launch title for the Super Nintendo, the specs on this beauty is what takes the real deal of this competition. The Super Nintendo was able to beat out the Sega Genesis despite Sega's claim on their upper advantage on specs, but in reality, Super Nintendo topped what Sega thought that they could do. Nintendo was the silent assassin in the competition, as Sega has been as loud as they could about their blast processing. But at the end of the day, they're the same console that has their soundtrack sounding like
Golly, dude, this sound chip was co-collaborated with Yamaha and Texas Instruments. How does a company mess up that much that they have these two big companies collaborating for a sound chip, and they don't even sound as good as the other guy?
The Super Nintendo sound chip was built in-house and was mainly sample-based. The Sega Genesis had a sound chip that was capable of running its own incorporated sound channels built into the system, similar to the original NES. But damn bro, the Genesis still failed on sound capabilities. Yes, I am aware about how divided the argument may be on SNES and Genesis audio capabilities, but at the same time, if you take a listen to both of their audio systems on the same video game, it gets pretty obvious which system may sound better. I'm guessing that when it came to replicating soundtracks from other video games, the Sega Genesis fell short. However, the Genesis was pretty good at making sure that their first party games carried the gritty, edgy tone that the Genesis held dear to in the 90s, and to be honest, that was probably the best suit for the system. This console was marketed much more blatantly as a game console for young adults. They uncensored Mortal Kombat after all.
You know, you've reached full adulthood when you become a copy of Mortal Kombat on Genesis. My doctor told me that, by the way.
Usually the family consoles were more appealing in consumer markets, as it was much easier to release a game that anybody could comfortably pick up and play without the struggle of feeling too old, young, or inexperienced to play the game. Now of course, games like Sonic the Hedgehog, Zoom, and Ghostbusters are some of the large library of family titles on the system, but the Genesis has a gargantuan library of games that are much more pointed towards people becoming adults. And when you're looking at the bigger picture, it just doesn't add up realistically. The thing is, when you're releasing a video game console, you want to appeal to a general audience that isn't going to be upset over games becoming too overly graphic or violent for their kids. It's probably the reason why most families went towards the Super Nintendo route. Plus, it made a lot more sense. Nintendo still had a lot of popularity points from the recognizable games the system was already churning out, and it still managed to find its way to create games for older audiences without going for any intense adult themes or graphic depictions of violence. Many kids that grew up with the Super Nintendo grew up with the same type of games. Super Mario World, F-Zero, Zombies Ate My Neighbors, Street Fighter 2. These games were the holy grail of peak childhood memories of the Super Nintendo. At the end of the day, the Sega Genesis overworked themselves through the improvement of specs, The Super Nintendo was just better and more advanced in every way possible minus the speed. Even after all that blast processing mumbo jumbo, Sega still had to release outside accessories to play games that had 3-dimensional effects or much heavier games that played on a CD-ROM. But Nintendo? They raw dogged their release of Star Fox like it was nothing, and Nintendo was able to pull it off safely. Video games like Donkey Kong Country and Toy Story were able to use 3D models pre-rendered to run on 2D sprite sheets, and it worked. Holy shit.
The SNES is still my favorite console to talk about from the 1990s. It really showed how Nintendo was able to keep its credibility as a family-friendly video game company while still getting its street cred from teenagers. I would be scared if I saw Mario with a bazooka.